final part of our lecture on resistance, as we try to understand the contemporary experiences of Indigenous peoples in North America. So far, we've heard the both troubling and inspiring story of Annie May Alakwash, and we've had an opportunity to hear directly from an Aboriginal Canadian elder, Ms. Becker, as she reflected on North America's Indigenous peoples and their relations with governments and non-Indigenous North Americans. Now, we'll take a look at each of the countries in turn, beginning first with Mexico. In our conversation with Jean Becker, she commented on the significance of land to Indigenous peoples. This is perhaps one of the most important shared or convergent themes for Indigenous peoples in all three North American nations, including Mexico. The Mexican Constitution of 1857 dealt a tremendous blow to Mexico's Indigenous peoples. A key element of this constitution was an attack on what had become, or what was, a communal land-owning system, entrenched since the colonial period. Aimed directly at the communal land holdings of the Catholic Church and Mexican towns, it also impacted the common lands of Indigenous villages. As a consequence of this political reform, Mexico's Indigenous peoples are thought to have lost millions of hectares of land by the early 20th century. As farms increasingly became commercial enterprises to serve tremendous new demands for agricultural products, the Indigenous peoples, deprived of their lands, became the workforce of these larger farms, or they simply left for the cities in search of work there. This changed in 1910 with the Mexican Revolution. Under the leadership of Emiliano Zapata, the Indigenous peoples in the Mexican state of Morelos took up arms to demand land. Indigenous peoples throughout Mexico heard their call to action. Article 27 in the Constitution of 1917 rewarded their efforts. It became the basis of agrarian policy in modern Mexico. In effect, the government would ensure that land was distributed to the poor, and Indigenous Mexicans benefited from this. It was the government of Lázaro Cárdenas that really embraced the full meaning of Article 27. He saw the redistribution of land using the traditional form of communal landholding practiced by Indigenous Mexicans as a key to increased prosperity. If taking away their lands had left them impoverished, both in terms of culture and material wealth, then it was thought that returning the land should help to restore the well-being of these communities. Then in 1992, President Carlos Salinas introduced agrarian reforms that have once again undermined the economic base of Indigenous communities, a bit like what had happened with the Mexican Constitution of 1857. Under his reforms, assigned portions of communal lands could be sold, rented, or traded. This neoliberal approach, essentially privatization, has not necessarily worked to the benefit of Mexico's Indigenous peoples. In fact, you might remember from earlier in the course that the movement towards neoliberal privatization, symbolized particularly by Mexico's entry into the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, is what prompted the Zapatista uprising in Chiapas, the most southern state in Mexico. The Zapatista Army of National Liberation, or EZLN, declared war against the Mexican state the very day NAFTA went into effect in 1994. Significantly, the group took its name from Emiliano Zapata, the great agrarian reformer and revolutionary commander of the previous century. Among other demands, the EZLN and its leaders, such as Subcomandante Marcos, insisted that the Mexican government truly and authentically institute the land reforms that had been set out in the 1917 Constitution. For 2 weeks, there was intense fighting between the Mexican army and some 3,000 members of the EZLN who had managed to seize towns and cities in Chiapas. Prisoners were freed from jails and buildings were set on fire. A ceasefire was eventually negotiated by a prominent and popular Catholic bishop, but the tensions remain to this day and speak to the significance of land and the nature of its ownership as symbols of power and prosperity for Indigenous Mexicans. Before we leave Mexico, it's worth commenting briefly on the question of identity as it relates to Mexican Indigenous peoples. In the wake of the Mexican Revolution, a movement known as Indigenismo took hold. It essentially had three goals. First, it sought to rediscover the glory and triumph of the Indian past. Second, it sought to improve the material well-being of Indigenous peoples. And third, it revived the long-standing goal of assimilation into a fully blended Mexican nation. Remember the idea of mestizaje from earlier in the course. Various Mexican governments, for more than half of the 20th century, even those that established bureaucratic structures such as the Department of Indian Affairs or the National Indian Institute to materially improve living conditions, did so while maintaining an overall agenda of assimilation. By the 1960s, though, widespread attitudes began to change. Cultural pluralism was increasingly accepted as a fact of life in Mexico. Rather than forced assimilation, new policies advanced the idea of unity through diversity. Bilingual education and cultural preservation were seen as noble goals. An amendment to the Constitution in 1991 confirmed this new direction. Mexico was declared a multi-ethnic nation. Of course, this is not to suggest that Mexicans suddenly woke up one day and gave up on the idea of mestizaje. Given the cultural predominance of mestizo identity, that would not be very likely. But at least in official policy, there was increased recognition and support for minorities, including indigenous Mexicans. Improving the material well-being and addressing the real barriers to full economic prosperity and political power for indigenous Mexicans will still require much work, just as Jean Becker suggested will be the case in the other parts of North America. And it's to the United States that I next turn my attention. In our first set of lectures on colonization, we examined how Native Americans responded to the challenges of European settlement. We saw then that many American First Nations fiercely fought against encroachment on their traditional lands. But we also saw that increasingly in the 1800s, America was intent on achieving what was seen to be its manifest destiny, the creation of a nation that would extend the western frontier to the Pacific, if not to every edge of the North American continent. The dispossession of Native Americans in this process was profound. Under the American Constitution, the federal government has the primary responsibility to work with Native Americans, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs was established in 1824 as the key bureaucracy to carry out this responsibility. Throughout the 19th century, more than 200 treaties were signed with American First Nations, but the Bureau of Indian Affairs in this period also maintained significant control over many aspects of Native American life and made use of this power to promote an agenda of assimilating Native Americans into the American cultural mainstream. Beginning with the interwar period, legislation affecting Native Americans did begin to change in terms of its overall approach. In 1924, for example, the Snyder Act recognized Native Americans born in the U.S. as full American citizens with the right to vote, in theory. That said, many Native Americans could not actually vote because the American Constitution allows for individual states to decide who can vote. In the end, New Mexico was the last state to enfranchise Native Americans, and this did not happen until 1962. The American federal government did take other measures to provide for a greater degree of self-determination for Native Americans. The Indian Reorganization Act, passed in 1934, encouraged the creation of local governments that would be less dependent on the Bureau of Indian Affairs. This act allowed individual First Nations to determine who was a member and to decide who could conduct business on reservations. The sale of reservation lands was also stopped by this act. Overall, this legislation can be seen as an important first step in the direction of increased autonomy for First Nations in the U.S. Then, for about a decade, from the mid-1950s to the mid-1960s, there was an attempt in the U.S. to eliminate the special status of Native Americans. Congress passed a resolution calling for Native Americans to be subject to the same laws and entitled to the same privileges and responsibilities as are applicable to other citizens of the United States, to end their status as wards of the United States, and to grant them all of the rights and prerogatives pertaining to American citizenship. In effect, the termination laws, as they were known, would end federal government relations with and recognition of tribal governments, and would end federal recognition of tribal jurisdiction over their lands. Almost immediately, the laws were attacked by opponents who argued that Native Americans occupied a special place in society and that the government had a duty to honor its commitments to recognize and support the cultures and local governments of its First Nations. In the end, this mid-20th century effort at assimilation was abandoned. A little over 100 tribes were terminated, affecting just over 13,000 Native Americans, and nearly 1.5 million acres of land held in trust. The communities that had pursued termination as an option, including the Menominee of Wisconsin, found that it had a devastating impact on their health, education, and economic stability. Instead, from the 1960s onwards, a new, more strident and vocal activism took hold amongst Native Americans that sought to address the social, political, and economic marginalization experienced by their communities. This, of course, includes the efforts of organizations like the American Indian Movement and individuals like Annie Mae Aquash, addressed in the first part of this lecture. In addition to occupying Wounded Knee, Native Americans also dramatically occupied Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay from 1969 to 1972. Their efforts weren't in vain. They reversed once and for all the assimilationist policies that had predominated for centuries. The Indian Civil Rights Act of 1968 guaranteed Native Americans the civil rights accorded to all citizens, but also recognized the legality of tribal law on reservations. Official policy rejected the approach of the termination laws and endorsed the concept of special status for Native Americans. America's First Nations were affirmed to be sovereign entities capable of negotiating with Washington and of governing themselves. In spite of these political advances, Native Americans today do still face significant social and economic barriers. Housing, especially on reservations, is problematic. Shortages lead to overcrowding, and housing is often substandard. The average life expectancy of Native Americans is nearly 5 years shorter than is the case for Americans generally, and nearly 30% of Native Americans are living below the federal poverty line. Yet, as we heard from Jean when she was speaking about Canada, Native Americans are also a fast-growing segment of the American population too. In the last decade, their population has grown by almost 27%, compared to just under 10% for the American population as a whole. More than 5 million Native Americans live in the U.S. today, representing 1.7% of the population. We'll end our lecture with Canada and its Aboriginal peoples. In this case, though, we have Jean Becker's amazing insights from part 2 that have already addressed this topic so very well, so I'm not going to try to repeat what she said. It's useful, though, just to highlight some of the interesting parallels raised by Jean relative to what we've heard about Mexican and American indigenous peoples. Land, as Jean said, has clearly been central to the experiences of indigenous peoples. We've seen that in the case of Mexico and in the U.S. as well. We've seen that in the case of Mexico and in the U.S. as well. And in Canada, some of the most difficult issues that have arisen for First Nations have related to land. We could, for instance, think of the Oka crisis in 1990. This standoff between the Mohawk First Nation in Kanesatake and the town of Oka in Quebec arose when the municipality planned to expand a golf course in the neighborhood onto land traditionally used by the Mohawk. Aboriginal Canadians and Native Americans from across the continent joined with the Mohawk in their resistance. On the other side, local police were supplemented by provincial police, and eventually even the Canadian military was called upon by the provincial premier at the time, Robert Bourassa. The crisis lasted nearly 80 days, and early on resulted in the death of one Quebec provincial police officer. The protest was finally brought to an end through negotiation. The golf course expansion was cancelled. The entire event was covered extensively in the media, and as a consequence, all Canadians became very aware of just how important land was in the relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Canadians. But even after Oka, there have certainly been other protests over land, notably at Ipperwash, where unarmed protester Dudley George was killed by the Ontario Provincial Police. Other conflicts over land have been the subject of legal land claims. The federal government established an Office of Native Claims in 1974, and since then, hundreds of claims have been sorted. Claims generally fall into one of two categories. Specific claims relate to the historic treaties, and questions as to whether or not the Canadian government has fulfilled its obligations. Comprehensive claims relate to areas of Canada where the land rights of Aboriginal Canadians were never dealt with through the negotiation of a treaty.
Yes.
Canada's newest Northern Territory, Nunavut, was essentially the result of the settlement of a comprehensive land claim with the Inuit. In addition to land, there are also parallels in the North American experience of Indigenous peoples when it comes to the issue of assimilation.
Yeah.
Just as has been the case in Mexico and the U.S., Aboriginal Canadians have also been confronted by tremendous pressures at times to assimilate into the Canadian cultural mainstream. Jean mentioned the 1969 White Paper proposed by the government of Pierre Trudeau. At the time, Jean Chrétien was Minister of Indian Affairs. Of course, years later, he too would become a Prime Minister. Their policy paper proposed ending the special legal relationship between Aboriginal people and the Canadian state, in effect dismantling the Indian Act that had governed that relationship since the 19th century. There's a clear parallel here with the attempt to do much the same thing in the U.S. with the termination laws. It's quite possible that in the Canadian instance, the motives behind this proposal were a little less self-serving than had been the case in the U.S. The Canadian version was more likely the result of Trudeau's larger philosophical belief in a just society that he believed should afford all Canadians the same rights and opportunity. To his mind, the Indian Act was discriminatory. For Aboriginal Canadians, though, the White Paper was largely seen as a betrayal. It failed to recognize or honor the special rights of Aboriginal peoples and did nothing to deal effectively with the historical grievances related to land and treaty rights. Assimilation seemed to underpin the entire project. Jean noted that, in the end, Aboriginal Canadians wholeheartedly rejected the White Paper. In effect, the only thing it achieved was to bring together Aboriginal Canadians in a spirited and effective political resistance to the government's proposed policy. With the agenda of assimilation finally put to rest, Aboriginal Canadians have continued to work towards and advocate for achieving greater equality within Canada. Again, Jean mentioned the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples as a significant development here. Established in the early 1990s, the Royal Commission ultimately set out a 20-year agenda for implementing changes in a comprehensive report of some 4,000 pages in 5 volumes. One important outcome of the Royal Commission's work was the light that it shone on the horrific treatment generations of Aboriginal children were subjected to as part of the residential school system created by the government and ran by Christian churches, with the clear intent to assimilate these kids through the forcible erasure of their Aboriginal cultures, languages, and spirituality. It would still take another decade after the Royal Commission produced its report, but the Canadian government did finally establish an Indian Residential Schools Truth and Reconciliation Commission as part of an important settlement with residential school survivors. And in the words of the Canadian Prime Minister at the time, Stephen Harper, as a positive step in forging a new relationship between Aboriginal peoples and other Canadians. As in the U.S., though, that new relationship will also require more effective solutions to some of the socioeconomic barriers that continue to confront Aboriginal Canadians. A 2012 protest and hunger strike by Chief Teresa Spence, leader of the Attawapiskat First Nation, once again highlighted for Canadians just how much ground still needs to be gained in order to close the gap in social and living conditions between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Canadians. Aboriginal Canadians face higher levels of unemployment, lower levels of income when they are employed, serious shortcomings in housing, especially for those who